It was the middle of the day. The kind of ordinary afternoon where carts rattled across concrete floors, where someone was debating paint samples, where employees moved aisle to aisle doing what they'd done 100 times before. And then, gunfire. Sharp, loud, echoing through a warehouse that wasn't built to absorb sound like that. For half a second, people froze. That brief moment where the brain tries to make sense of something it's never supposed to hear. Then the screaming started. Customers ran. Employees scattered. Someone dropped to the floor. In one of the aisles, a young woman lay bleeding, shot while she was working, in a place where no one expects to die. Police would rush in. Paramedics would follow. The store would fall silent in a way it never had before. But by the time help arrived, it was already too late. She was gone. Her name was Brooklyn Sims. Hey there, and welcome to Sleuthy Express, where the timeline stays tight, the story stays true, and I leave the commentary where it belongs. Here, it's true crime in record time. Today's case is one that starts with something simple, a belief, a suspicion, a moment where waiting felt harder than acting. And it unravels into a chain of choices made before the facts were ever clear. It's a story that raises uncomfortable questions about certainty, about influence, and about what happens when anger is reinforced instead of challenged. Because this violence didn't come from nowhere. It grew in conversations, in messages, and in moments where stopping felt optional. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode includes references to domestic violence and gun violence. Please take care while watching. All right, let's go back to where it all began. It was just after midday on Friday, August 11th, 2023, inside the Home Depot on Davis Highway in Pensacola, Florida. The store was busy. Forklifts were moving through the aisles. Customers were browsing lighting and lumber. Employees were mid-shift, focused, routine, unguarded. Brooklyn Sims was working inventory. She was in the lighting aisle, counting items, doing exactly what she'd been hired to do, when a man walked into the store. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't draw attention to himself. He moved through the aisles like any other customer until he reached her. Witnesses would later tell police there was a brief interaction. He tapped her on the shoulder. Words were exchanged. Then, without warning, he pulled out a firearm and opened fire. Multiple shots rang out, echoing through the store. Customers ran. Employees dove for cover. Brooklyn fell to the floor in the aisle where she'd been working moments earlier. By the time police and paramedics arrived, Brooklyn Sims was already gone. The man who shot her had fled the store. And what initially sounded like an active shooter situation would quickly be understood for what it was. A targeted act of violence carried out in a public place. Brooklyn Sims was 18 years old. She was a young mother, working an inventory job that took her from store to store, doing physically demanding work to support her daughter. People who knew Brooklyn described her as focused on stability, on keeping life predictable for her child, even when her own circumstances weren't. She showed up. She worked. She handled responsibilities most people twice her age are still trying to figure out. On the day she was killed, Brooklyn wasn't meeting anyone. She wasn't in conflict. She wasn't running late or causing a scene. She was at work, counting inventory, doing her job, expecting to go home when her shift was over. And that's what makes what happened next so difficult to absorb. Because the violence that ended Brooklyn Sims's life didn't find her in a dark alley or during an argument. It found her in the middle of a workday, in a public place, with no warning. So let's go back. Back to the store. Back to the aisle. Back to the moment everything changed. By the time police arrived, the Home Depot on Davis Highway had already been evacuated. Brooklyn Sims had been shot while working inventory in the lighting aisle. She was found face down, unresponsive. Paramedics were called. She was pronounced dead at the scene. What first came across dispatch as an active shooter situation began to change almost immediately. Witnesses told officers the shooter didn't linger. There was no standoff, no attempt to hide inside the store, no continued threat moving through the aisles. He fired, he turned, and he ran. Based on witness accounts and what officers saw inside the building, the active shooter call was downgraded. This wasn't random violence. It was targeted. The shots were concentrated in one place, one aisle, one person. And once that became clear, the investigation shifted. Because if this was targeted, then the most important question wasn't what happened. It was, who was he? And why was Brooklyn Sims the only person he went looking for? As officers worked to secure the store, another call came in. A passerby reported a firearm lying along the side of Davis Highway, about half a mile north of the Home Depot. An officer responded and located the weapon. It was a black 9mm Glock. The gun was jammed. There was one round still in the chamber. Based on standard magazine capacity, investigators could already tell nearly every round had been fired. Back inside the store, crime scene technicians began documenting the scene. They recovered multiple shell casings from the lighting aisle, all clustered in the same area. There was no indication of stray fire, no pattern suggesting panic or randomness. Everything pointed back to a single target. At the same time, detectives turned to surveillance footage. While not every aisle was covered, cameras did capture activity in the parking lot. They showed a vehicle entering the lot and leaving shortly after the shooting. That vehicle description was immediately broadcast to officers in the area. Then, just over a mile away, a matching vehicle was located near a medical facility and an AMC theater parking lot. The area was secured. At that point, investigators had three things: a weapon, a vehicle, and a narrowing window of time. They still didn't know who the shooter was, but they were closing in. At 1:44 p.m., 23 minutes after the shooting, dispatch received another call. This time, it wasn't from a witness. It was from the shooter. He told the operator he wanted to turn himself in. Officers were directed to the area near Bayou Boulevard, just over a mile from the Home Depot. When they arrived, they located the suspect near an AMC theater parking lot. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He was missing a shirt. His pants were wet. A creek ran nearby. Officers took him into custody without incident. He had his cell phone with him. It was seized. He provided the password. With the suspect in hand, the scope of the investigation widened. Crime scene technicians were dispatched to 3 locations: the Home Depot, the site where the firearm was recovered, and the area near the arrest. Each scene was documented, each piece of evidence logged. Only then, after the shooter was secured, after the weapon was recovered, after the immediate threat was over, did investigators begin asking the next set of questions. Who was this man? And what connection did he have to Brooklyn Sims that led him to that aisle on that day? Once the shooter was in custody, investigators were able to identify him. He was not a stranger. He was not a co-worker, not a random customer, not someone who crossed Brooklyn's path by chance. He was the father of her child, Keith Agee. That single fact immediately reframed the case. What had first looked like public violence now clearly fell into a different category entirely. This was intimate. And because of that relationship, investigators knew the answers they were looking for wouldn't be found inside the store. They would be found in the days and the hours before he ever walked through those doors. His phone was seized. Communications were preserved. Timelines were reconstructed. And as detectives began reviewing what led up to that afternoon, one detail stood out almost immediately. This wasn't a spontaneous act. There had been contact, ongoing contact, and a belief that had begun driving decisions before anyone inside that Home Depot knew there was a threat at all. As investigators began reviewing the contents of his phone, one theme emerged almost immediately. In the days leading up to the shooting, he had become fixated on a single belief. He believed Brooklyn Sims had given him an STD. At that point, there were no confirmed test results in hand, no diagnosis, just suspicion. But instead of waiting for clarity, that belief began driving his decisions. Messages showed growing resentment, anger, a sense that he had been wronged. By the morning of August 11th, that belief had hardened into certainty. While he was at work, he received a call from a medical clinic. Whatever he understood that call to mean, it escalated everything. He began telling others that Brooklyn had given him an STD, gonorrhea. And then the focus shifted. This was no longer about accusations. It became about finding her. Once investigators established that the focus had shifted from accusation to locating Brooklyn Sims, they followed the trail inside his phone. What they found showed he wasn't guessing. He was asking. He wanted to know where Brooklyn was and when she would be there. And that information didn't come from surveillance or chance or following her. It came from a conversation. From the messages on his phone, investigators could see that someone close to him was providing details about Brooklyn's location. From that person, he learned she was working out of town that day and exactly where she would be. Inside a Home Depot on Davis Highway in Pensacola. The messages also showed this wasn't just about where. There were discussions about how, about timing, about avoiding certain outcomes, about making sure his child wasn't present. At this stage of the investigation, detectives still hadn't examined anyone else's phone. They didn't yet know the full scope of what had been said or what might have been removed. But they did know this. The location wasn't accidental. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had helped him get there. Once investigators established that Keith knew where Brooklyn Sims was, they began reconstructing what happened next. The messages showed that after getting her location, he didn't hesitate. He left work. From there, investigators traced his movements through location data, timestamps, and surveillance. He went home. He didn't linger. Later testimony would show he left his vehicle running, went straight inside, retrieved a firearm, and went right back out. He then got in his car and started driving south toward Pensacola. The trip from McIntosh, Alabama, normally takes around 2 hours. That day, it took less. During the drive, he stopped briefly for gas. He didn't turn around. He didn't slow down. As he got closer to Pensacola, his focus narrowed. Investigators would later establish that just before arriving at the Home Depot, Keith disabled location tracking on his phone. Shortly after 1 p.m., he arrived at the Home Depot on Davis Highway. He parked near the entrance, and then he went inside. Inside the store, Brooklyn Sims was working inventory in the lighting aisle. She was not alone. Other employees were nearby. They stated that the shooter approached Brooklyn, tapped her on the shoulder, and said something to her. Brooklyn turned toward him. According to witness accounts, she did not argue. She did not escalate the situation. She turned as if to walk away. That was when the shooting began. Multiple rounds were fired in quick succession. Brooklyn was struck and fell to the floor in the aisle where she had been working moments earlier. The shooter continued firing until the weapon jammed. Then he turned and ran. There was no pursuit inside the store. no attempt to hide. The entire encounter lasted seconds. By the time anyone fully understood what had happened, it was already over. As investigators continued reviewing Keith's phone, one thing became clear very quickly. He hadn't been acting in isolation. In the hours before the shooting, there had been ongoing communication, not just emotional venting, but active conversation. Messages showed that he wasn't guessing where Brooklyn Sims might be. He was asking, and he was being answered. Investigators could also see that he didn't keep his intentions to himself. In those messages, Keith stated plainly that he planned to shoot her. That detail mattered, because once intent is expressed and location is discussed, the case changes. At this stage, detectives still had only his phone. They had not yet accessed anyone else's messages or compared conversations, but they knew enough to recognize a shift. This was no longer just a question of what one person decided to do. It was a question of who knew what he intended and when. And that realization expanded the scope of the investigation. Once investigators established that Keith had shared his intent and received information about Brooklyn's location, they turned to the other side of that conversation. From the messages on his phone, they could see the contact wasn't distant or incidental. This was someone with direct access to Brooklyn's schedule, someone who knew where she was working that day, someone who could answer questions about timing without hesitation. Investigators traced that contact and identified her as Sheila Agee. She wasn't a stranger to the case. She was the shooter's mother. And she wasn't a peripheral figure in Brooklyn Sims's life. Sheila was also Brooklyn's supervisor at the inventory company where she worked, the person who coordinated assignments and transportation for out-of-town jobs. That proximity mattered, because it meant Sheila didn't just know of Brooklyn, she knew where she was supposed to be and when. With that identification, the investigation widened again. What detectives had now was not just evidence of intent and not just evidence of location sharing. It was evidence that those things intersected through someone who stood at the center of both lives. After Sheila Agee was identified, investigators focused on the messages recovered from his phone. Those messages showed that Keith did not keep his intentions private. He told her directly that he planned to shoot Brooklyn. Investigators could also see that the conversation went beyond awareness. It moved into direction. In the messages found on his phone, Sheila suggested that if he was going to do this, it should not happen in front of their child. She suggested the Home Depot as the place where it should happen. She provided Brooklyn's location, telling him where she was working that day inside the Home Depot on Davis Highway in Pensacola. The messages also included instructions about how. She told Keith not to shoot her car and to wait until Brooklyn was separated from her. She told him Brooklyn would be working on the warehouse floor, and she told him she had not warned Brooklyn that he was coming. These weren't assumptions investigators made later. They were details found inside the messages recovered from his phone. And once investigators saw that intent, location, timing, and method had all been discussed in advance, the case stopped being treated as the actions of one person alone. That meant this could no longer be treated as a single-actor crime. With that determination, investigators moved quickly. Within days of the shooting, Sheila Agee was taken into custody. Because what began as one person walking into a store with a gun had now been legally reframed as something planned and something shared. She was arrested not as a witness, not as an accessory after the fact, but in connection with the planning that unfolded before Brooklyn Sims was killed. At the time of her arrest, investigators seized Sheila's phone. When forensic examiners began the extraction, they didn't find a matching record of the conversations. Instead, they discovered the messages had been deleted. Investigators determined that the deletions occurred at 1:59 p.m., just minutes after the shooting, while she stood in the parking lot of the store. While police were rushing to the Home Depot, while 911 calls were still coming in. While the scene was still unfolding, Sheila was deleting her conversation with her son. What investigators also noted was that in the messages recovered from Keith's phone, Sheila had specifically instructed him to delete their conversation. He didn't. She did. That detail mattered, because the messages weren't lost. They weren't missing by accident. They were removed by the person who had urged that they not exist at all. And that discovery didn't replace the evidence already recovered from Keith's phone. It confirmed it. Because now investigators had more than intent, more than location sharing, more than direction. They had evidence that someone who knew what had happened was trying to erase her role before the investigation had even fully begun. By the time Keith Agee was arrested, detectives understood how the shooting unfolded, where it happened, when it happened, and how he got there. But understanding the mechanics was only the first layer of this case. What wasn't clear yet was how the conversations leading up to that moment would ultimately be understood. Because when Sheila Agee's messages were first discussed, they were often described in simple terms, as encouragement, or instruction, or planning. But when those messages were finally examined in full, line by line, tone by tone, and in sequence, a more complicated picture emerged. Some of her messages appeared to discourage him. Others seemed to redirect him. And some, on the surface, sounded like the way a mother might speak to her grown son when trying to manage his emotions. But in this case, intent wasn't the only thing that mattered. What mattered was how those messages functioned in the moments before the shooting and how they were received. Because it wasn't one sentence that put Sheila Agee in legal jeopardy. It was the totality of the conversation. And that meaning didn't become clear until trial. If you want to understand how those messages were interpreted in court, why tone mattered as much as content, how absence of intervention mattered more than intent, and how a series of exchanges led to consequences no one initially expected. I left that deeper analysis out of this episode on purpose. This is Sleuthy Express, the tight version that respects your time. But if this is a case you want to understand, not just know, I break it down step by step on the Sleuthy Stories podcast. I'll meet you there.